My sister slapped a $100 price tag on my useless medals while I was upstairs making her kids pancakes. I heard her voice drifting up the staircase, sharp and careless, as she told someone on the phone that $100 was more than these bravery trinkets deserved. I was still wiping batter off my fingers when the words hit me so hard my chest tightened. For a moment, I just stood there in Grace's house, in the same kitchen where I had cooked her children breakfast for 3 straight mornings, feeling the kind of sting only a toxic family can deliver. I walked down the stairs slowly, each step colder than the last, expecting some kind of misunderstanding. Instead, I saw my mother, Linda, standing in the living room acting as if everything was normal. Grace had already walked out with a cardboard box tucked under her arm. She did not even look at me as she passed. I asked my mother where my medals were. She refused to meet my eyes and murmured that Grace had taken a few things to clear space and told me not to start drama. I asked again. This time, Linda sighed as if I were a stubborn child. Those medals do not matter, Avery. Your sister has real responsibilities. She did not even know what she was defending. Those medals held pieces of my life that cost blood time and years I could never get back. But they had always believed my military service was just some phase, some temporary escape from not fitting into the perfect life they worshipped. I stepped outside fast enough to see Grace's SUV pulling out of the driveway. I followed her to downtown Tacoma on instinct alone, the betrayal so raw I could taste metal in my mouth. She parked beside a small pawn shop with faded paint and a crooked neon light. I watched her lift my box like it weighed nothing and march inside as if she were returning library books. I entered seconds later, but stayed behind a shelf listening. Grace set my medals on the counter and told the man behind it that her sister would never miss them and that $100 was fine. She called them clutter, junk. I saw the man's name tag, Samuel Hayes, and noticed the old framed photo on the wall behind him of a much younger version of him in uniform, Q Master Sergeant, 20-something years in service at least. When he opened the box, his movement slowed. I saw his brows pull together as he lifted medal after medal until he reached the one that carried the small engraved code on its back. The metallic clink echoed too loudly in the quiet room. Sam froze, truly froze. His hand trembled almost imperceptibly before he looked up at Grace with an expression I had seen on soldiers facing something they were not prepared for. Not fear exactly, but recognition. Deep recognition. "You said she will not miss it?" he asked quietly. Grace rolled her eyes. "It is just some military stuff she hoards. Can we hurry?" Sam stepped back half a step, then another. His voice dropped lower. "Do you have any idea who your sister is?" Before Grace could scoff, he reached up, pulled the shop's curtain sign closed, and turned the lock. The click rang through the room. Grace snapped, asking what he was doing, but he did not answer. He lifted the medal again, the rare one, the one very few people in the world ever receive, and even fewer ever survive the circumstances that earn it. His jaw clenched, like something in him was reliving a memory. Then he picked up his office phone, dialed a number etched on the medal's back, and spoke into the receiver with a tone of respect that made my pulse jump. "Ma'am, I believe I have something that belongs to you. You need to come here alone." My phone vibrated in my pocket. Unknown number. When I answered, his voice carried a steadiness I recognized from briefing rooms where every second mattered. "Major Lockwood, this is Master Sergeant Retired Samuel Hayes. Please come to my shop immediately. It is about your medals." "I am so sorry, ma'am." I drove without breathing. When I walked in, Sam stood at attention. Not casual respect, polite nod respect, but full spine, straight shoulders, squared attention like a soldier greeting superior rank. He placed the box on the counter carefully and opened it with both hands. When he touched the rare medal again, he spoke softly. "In 28 years of service, I never saw this up close. People with this saved entire units, sometimes entire regions." He looked at me with the kind of awe that never existed in my family's eyes. My sister tried to sell it for $100, I said. Sam exhaled once slow. Ma'am, if your sister knew who you really are in our world, she would be the one begging you for $100 of mercy. If you have ever felt your sacrifices meant nothing to a toxic family, stay with me. This is not just revenge. This is quiet justice, silent revenge, and a lesson in betrayal that ends with dignity over money and real truth and closure. A few days before the pawn shop and the $100 humiliation, I had returned to Tacoma, telling myself it would only be for a short visit, just enough time to check on my mother Linda and let my sister Grace cool down from her latest financial storm. And even then, I already felt that familiar weight settle on my shoulders the moment my boots touched the driveway, the quiet dread that always came with stepping back into a house where I was useful but never valued. At that time, nothing had exploded, yet everything still wore that thin mask of family peace, the kind that cracks the moment someone breathes too loudly. I had driven in from Joint Base Lewis McChord, where my unit was rotating between intelligence cycles, the base only 40 minutes away, yet so far from the world my family imagined I lived in, because to them I was just the daughter who worked with computers in the Army, someone who typed and clicked and never faced anything dangerous, someone who at 35 should have had a husband, a mortgage, and a pair of kids to post about on holidays, not deployments or classified missions they never cared to understand. Grace was already in the living room when I walked in, wearing an expensive blazer that did not match the anxiety in her eyes, juggling phone calls about listings she pretended were high-end, while whispering about buyers backing out or commissions shrinking. Real estate had never been stable for her, but she dressed it up online with motivational quotes and curated brunch photos, always trying to prove she was winning at a life she barely held together. Linda came from the kitchen and hugged me with that soft, quick touch that said she was glad I was here, but also ready to unload every problem she had saved for me. She lived almost entirely on the money I sent her, though she never admitted it directly. She would say things like, "The pension covers most of it, but the bills keep going up," or "Thank God you are responsible, Avery, because your sister has a whole family to deal with," as if my service and the danger attached to it meant I had less right to rest. The next morning, we went grocery shopping, a simple task that somehow always managed to shrink me down to the awkward teenager they used to scold Linda, moved through aisles with the determination of someone counting every cent while telling me to put back anything not on sale. She glanced at my uniform jacket hanging over the cart and muttered that if I had a normal office job with real insurance and a predictable paycheck, I would not have to work this hard or risk my life. She meant it as motherly advice, but it carried that undertone I had heard all my life, that my path was odd and inconvenient. That service only mattered when it benefited them and not when it demanded respect. I paid for the groceries, and as I handed my card to the cashier, Linda leaned closer and whispered, not to show off because people would think I had too much money and should be giving more to family or saving more. For when the Army decides you are too old to keep around toxic family patterns, repeated themselves in these small moments, drama family dynamics, wrapped in politeness, tiny cuts, delivered with a smile. They knew nothing about who I actually was in the military, not because I hid it out of shame, but because classified work had shaped my life into two parallel realities, one they saw and one they never would. In the halls of a secure wing on base, there was a wall of names and photographs honoring those who had made high-level contributions to intelligence operations. My photo hung there in a narrow frame under my code name Oracle 7. A reminder of the mission that had shifted entire strategies overseas. Yet if I had told Grace, she would have scoffed and asked why my picture was not on a magazine instead. In group chats among younger female officers, my name floated like a quiet legend, someone who did not post achievements or boast about missions, yet whose decisions had safeguarded teams they admired. I never reacted to those messages, but I read them during long nights in the operations center, when exhaustion blurred everything but purpose. Back home, though, my accomplishments translated to nothing recognizable. Grace would tell people I worked in tech support for the Army, and Linda would nod, saying it was a blessing. I had a safe position since I was too sensitive for anything more intense. Never mind that I had briefed colonels and strategists. Never mind that my choices had determined the survival of people who trusted me with their lives to my family. I was a woman wasting the best years of her life without a ring or children to prove I had made it. The day after our grocery run, Grace insisted on showing me a new listing she claimed would change her career. A small, overpriced house she walked through with false enthusiasm. She told me she needed a big closing soon because real estate ebbs and flows, and families should support each other during lean times. Her voice dipped on the words, support each other, a phrase she used only when she meant I should open my wallet, not that she would ever admit it outright. Leaving the house tour, she talked loudly on her phone about her hard-working life, while hinting at how comfortable I must be with Army benefits, as if I did not spend half my service sleeping in tents or intel bunkers, in places she could not spell, as if my life were easy. On the drive back, I felt the exhaustion wrap itself around me again, the kind that comes from knowing you will never be seen for who you are, only for what people want you to be. Then my secure phone vibrated with a coded text, a short string of numbers that only meant one thing: I had been officially recommended for a national-level security award, the kind that required clearance reviews and often came with a ceremony in Washington, D.C., a recognition so rare that even seasoned analysts never reached it. I stared at the message, letting its weight settle in my chest, not with bragging rights, but with the quiet satisfaction of knowing my work mattered in ways my family could never comprehend. I looked out the window at the gray Tacoma sky and let myself smile, a small, private smile, the kind that belonged only to me, because I knew I would not tell them, not yet. Maybe not ever. Some honors were too sacred to waste on people who saw my medals as clutter to be boxed and sold, and although I did not know it, then the betrayal that would soon unfold would make that silence feel like protection rather than distance. When I look back at the days leading up to the pawn shop betrayal, I realize how strange it was to live in two worlds that barely touched each other. One where my decisions shaped missions and protected entire units, and another where my own family could look at me and see nothing but a daughter who had failed to meet their expectations. And that contrast became even sharper when memories of Operation Ember Gate surfaced in my mind. Not as dramatic flashbacks, but as quiet reminders that the woman Grace dismissed at the dinner table was the same woman who had once spent 40 sleepless hours decoding a pattern of shifting financial transactions across encrypted channels used by a hostile network in the Middle East in 2021, a pattern no algorithm had caught because it required someone who understood human behavior as much as technical structure. I remembered sitting in the dim tactical operations room with screens casting pale light across worn faces, hearing the hum of servers and the constant buzz of radios as I traced the inconsistencies in timing and language, the way the transfers were layered through third-party shell accounts, the way a fragment of coded phrasing matched something I had seen months prior in another operation. And in that moment, as everything snapped together, I realized a major strike was incoming toward a NATO base that had already been weakened by prior attacks. I briefed the room quickly yet clearly, outlining not just the numbers, but the intention behind them, the psychology of the actors, the urgency of movement. And as I spoke, I could feel the shift in the room as seasoned operators leaned forward and commanders exchanged glances, because they recognized something they rarely voiced, that sometimes the quiet intelligence major carried weight equal to an entire battalion. When the colonel who oversaw joint operations stepped closer to another officer and whispered, "That is Oracle 7. If she says we move, we move," I felt the strange stillness that comes when your identity is seen without fanfare, without family politics or sibling comparison, only truth. The strike was prevented. Units were evacuated in time, and lives were saved in numbers that were never disclosed to the public, yet etched into my memory with painful clarity. A week later, in a small secure ceremony, with no cameras, no reporters, and certainly no family, a senior representative from the Department of Defense placed a medal into my hands, looked directly at me and said, "Only a few people will ever know what you did, we do." And that is enough a sentence that should have warmed me, but instead carved an odd loneliness into my ribs, because it reminded me there was no one in my life outside the uniform who would ever understand the magnitude of what had happened. After the ceremony, I returned to base, picked up my bag, and drove back to Tacoma for a short visit, telling myself I could balance both worlds if I tried hard enough. When I stepped into my mother's house, I traded classified briefings for mundane chores without complaint because she needed help fixing the washing machine, and she was too afraid to call a handyman. So I crouched beside the leaking pipe, tightening valves, and replacing the worn hose, while she sat at the table sipping tea and reminding me again that a job with regular hours would give me more stability than this unpredictable military path. Later that evening, I helped my nephew with his math homework, explaining fractions with the same patience I used when explaining Intel anomalies to junior analysts. And for a brief moment, I allowed myself to feel a fragile sense of belonging until Grace walked through the doorway holding her phone in one hand and a stack of glossy real estate flyers in the other, her face twisted into that practiced smirk she wore whenever she felt insecure. She glanced at me and said, "If you're so good with strategies, maybe you can strategize a real job after the Army, because you can't play soldier forever." And the words slid under my skin in a way she would never understand, because she said them with the confidence of someone who believed she had the right to belittle what she could not comprehend. I stayed silent because silence was easier than explaining the depth of my work to someone determined not to listen, but inside I felt the familiar sting that so many women in uniform feel when family reduces their service to a childish hobby rather than a profession that demands sacrifice. Days passed with little comments like that, building quietly small needles that accumulated until they formed a nest of resentment. Yet none of them prepared me for what I discovered on a tired afternoon when I sat on the couch, scrolling through my phone trying to unwind. I clicked onto Facebook out of habit, expecting nothing significant, and then my heart froze, because there on Grace's profile was a long, emotional post, accompanied by a picture of me in uniform holding 2 of my medals, a picture I had never given her permission to use, and above it she had written a dramatic story, painting me as a struggling veteran who was barely getting by, someone sacrificing everything, while our family fought to keep our home, begging for donations to help us pay off debts we did not have. She had used phrases like, "My brave sister has given everything, yet has nothing left, and please help our family survive these impossible times. And every donation will go straight to supporting her service, even though every dollar went directly into her own account, which she had proudly linked at the end of the post." Comments poured in from strangers praising her for supporting her veteran sister and promising to donate. People called her a hero for standing by her family during hardship, and Grace responded to each message with manufactured humility, saying, "Thank you. We are so grateful. Avery deserves the world." And I felt something inside me snap quietly, because this was not just dishonesty, this was exploitation of my service, my image, my sacrifice. This was family betrayal woven into financial manipulation that crossed every boundary I thought we still had. When I confronted her page silently with my eyes burning, I realized this was not a lapse or a mistake. This was a decision she had made, believing she had the right to profit off my life while dismissing my achievements to my face. And in that moment, I understood that the distance between my 2 worlds was not an accident, but a shield I had built to protect the part of me that still believed service meant something. And I knew, without realizing, that the betrayal revealed on that glowing screen was only the beginning of something far darker waiting ahead. The Facebook post should have been my warning, but in a toxic family, the first betrayal rarely announces itself as the line you cannot cross. It sits quietly like a crack in glass, waiting for pressure. And that pressure arrived at my mother's dining table on a damp Saturday evening when she decided to host a small dinner with a few relatives and 2 neighbors. She wanted to impress the kind of gathering where people compare houses and cars and raises as if they are scoreboards for a life well lived. The table was crowded with dishes I had helped cook, food that should have felt comforting but tasted flat under the weight of the talk. Linda sat at one end glowing with hostess pride. Grace at the other end wore a bright dress and her practiced social media smile, and I sat along the side, the convenient extra pair of hands, close enough to fill glasses, far enough that no one really turned toward me unless they needed salt or a serving spoon. The conversation slid straight to Money, who had refinanced before rates jumped, who was thinking about buying a second property, who had just gotten a promotion. Laughter rose over mortgage numbers and bonus checks, easy and loud. And as I listened, I felt again that thin, cold wall between my world and theirs, my work counted in lives, and classified reports theirs in square footage and interest. Then Grace cleared her throat and said that this year had been brutal for her and Tyler, that the only reason they were still in their home was because of family, because of her generous little sister. She tipped her chin toward me with a soft smile that would have looked noble to anyone who did not know the truth, and she launched into the same story she had told the internet, how I supposedly insisted on helping with my small savings. How I lived, simply so they could keep a roof over their children's heads. How I told her I did not care about money, only about family. Each sentence turned my service into a prop and painted her as the brave guardian of a struggling veteran. And around the table, people nodded, eyes soft, offering sympathy to her. One of the neighbors, a man named Carl, glanced at the small glass cabinet in the living room where my medals sat and asked in a casual tone, "So, are those medals worth anything financially? Or are they just stories?" He did not say it cruelly, but the question still hit like a stone in my chest because it took everything I had lived through and stamped a price tag on it. I opened my mouth to answer, to say they were not about money, but before I could say a word, Grace laughed and cut across me emotionally. Sure, financially, maybe $100 at a pawn shop. Max, in the real world, bravery does not pay the bills. She dropped the words lightly like a joke, and a couple of people chuckled, grateful for an easy way to handle something they did not understand. Linda did not correct her, did not say that my work might matter in ways money never could. She simply poured more wine and let the line stain the room. My chest tightened. The edges of my vision fuzzed for a second. In one sentence, my medals had been dragged from a secure wall on base to the harsh lights of a pawn counter. My missions shrunk to a punchline in a room where no one knew what it meant to stare at a screen at 3 a.m, praying you had read the pattern right. And here, that whole life was being reduced to $100 and a smirk. Tyler leaned back in his chair and added his own easy insult. She is basically living off taxpayers anyway. Government job with benefits must be nice. He said it with a smug little grin, as if my paycheck came free of anxiety and responsibility, as if my body had never carried stress like a second skin. And again, no one challenged him. The words just slid into the conversation and stayed there. Heat climbed my neck. My eyes burned, but years in uniform had trained me to keep my face calm, even when everything inside me roared. So I stared at my plate and moved food around with my fork, forcing myself to swallow. Because speaking up would only invite the old labels, sensitive, dramatic, always overreacting, and I was too tired to hand them more proof. When people finally pushed their plates away and drifted toward the living room, I grabbed dishes and fled to the kitchen, hiding behind warm water and soap. The clink of plates, almost soothing compared to the voices in the other room, yet their words still floated in my name, wrapped in little comments. Weird married to the army. Probably does not know how to relax, said with that half-amused, half-pitying tone that makes you feel smaller than you ever felt in front of any commander. At least the army always pays her on time. Grace joked more than I can say for some of my clients, and another round of laughter rolled through the house, as if nothing cruel had been said at all. Standing at the sink, 10 steps from people who shared my blood, I felt more alone than I ever had overseas, because over there, no one questioned whether the work mattered here. The only parts of me that seemed to count were the pieces Grace could convert into a story or a bill payment. When the dishes were finally done, I dried my hands and walked back into the living room, refusing to vanish completely, and found everyone gathered near the coffee table, talking about cruises and beaches and room upgrades, planning trips to places I had only ever flown over on the way to somewhere dangerous, while in the other room my medals sat unseen, the only proof in this house that my life had been about more than overtime and interest rates. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Grace slip down the hallway with a quick glance over her shoulder, that restless spark in her eyes I had begun to recognize whenever she smelled opportunity. I followed a moment later and watched her open the glass door of the cabinet and lift the wooden case that held several of my highest awards. She carried it back into the living room with a bright grin and set it on the coffee table like a game. "Let us see what the hero brought home," she announced. People leaned in, suddenly interested, now that they could touch the shiny evidence of the life they had just mocked. Grace flipped open the lid and began picking up medals, turning them in her fingers, reading bits of engraving in a sing-song voice. Then she held one up and asked, "This one is for what?" Clicking the right keyboard at the right time. "Maybe you got a prize for staying awake in front of a computer." The laughter that followed was louder this time, easier because she had given them permission to treat my work as nothing more than a joke. I stepped right up to the table and said quietly, "Put them back." "Grace." My voice low but edged with steel, the same tone that made soldiers stop talking in a briefing room for a heartbeat. The air went still. I saw one of my cousins glance between us, but then Grace rolled her eyes and laughed. "Relax, they are just metal. It is not like anyone outside your little army friends cares." And with that, she made it clear to everyone exactly how little my service meant here, in this house, at this table. And even though I did not know yet that she would soon slap a $100 price tag on those same medals at a pawnshop counter, a cold certainty slid through me that tonight was the first time she truly weighed them in her mind and decided they were worth more as cash than as the story of my life. After the dinner, where my medals became a party trick instead of sacred history, the air in my mother's house never really cleared it, just thickened into something sticky and hard to breathe, and Grace, who always knew how to spin a moment into a narrative that made her look noble, began weaving a new story about who sacrificed what in this family. In the days that followed, she talked loudly on the phone in rooms I was sitting in, telling friends that she was exhausted from carrying everything on her shoulders, that being the daughter who actually stayed close to mom was draining her, that it was hard. When your sister just breezes in from her government job, plays hero for a week, and then disappears back to base while you handle the real-life mess, and because people only heard her side, they believed her. They always did. Linda started repeating pieces of that script too, not in a deliberately cruel way, more in the unconscious echo that comes from hearing the same thing enough times. She would pat my hand and say things like, "Grace is here with me all year. You send money, which is helpful, but you do not see the day-to-day, as if my deployments and long nights and every wire transfer that kept her afloat existed on a lesser plane than the errands Grace occasionally ran between open houses, and each time she said it, something inside me folded a little smaller. One morning, I drove Mom to a medical appointment, the waiting room full of outdated magazines and quiet coughs. I filled out her forms, made sure the receptionist understood her medication list, and when the bill came, I paid it without comment, sliding my card across the counter while my mother watched with a mix of relief and mild discomfort, the way she always did when confronted with the reality that I was the financial backbone she never acknowledged in the parking lot. As I helped Mom into the car, Grace swung her SUV into the space beside us, designer sunglasses perched on her headphone, in hand on speaker, complaining to someone about a deal falling through. She hung up long enough to smirk at me and say, "Good for you, you get to be the good daughter for 2 weeks." I get the rest of the year as if love and duty could be divided into calendar blocks and graded on visibility. As if the sleepless months I had spent halfway across the world counted for nothing, because I was not physically pouring her coffee every morning. I wanted to remind her that I sent most of my re-enlistment bonus to help Mom pay off credit cards Grace had maxed out and then walked away from. I wanted to say that every time I logged into my bank account, I saw the shape of my mother's survival carved into the balance. But I knew how that conversation would go. She would twist it into a guilt trip or accuse me of throwing money in her face, so I swallowed it and focused on helping Mom buckle her seatbelt while Grace walked ahead, texting already narrating the day in her head in a way that kept her the martyr. That afternoon, she cornered me at the kitchen table with a bright, casual tone that always meant danger. She unfolded some paperwork and laid it between us, talking quickly about an opportunity to expand her real estate business, a new office, a marketing budget, maybe even hiring an assistant. She said the bank loved her vision but needed stronger backing. And there it was, the real request. Avery, if you co-sign this loan with me, it will change everything. You have perfect credit, stable income. They will approve it in a heartbeat. We are family. This is how we help each other. She said it like a moral law rather than a personal favor that could gut my future. I looked over the numbers and felt my stomach tighten. It was not a small, personal loan. It was a heavy line of credit with terms that screamed risk, the kind of thing that could quietly devour my savings if she missed payments. And I could see in the way she tapped her nail against the paper that she had already decided I should say yes in her mind. My refusal would not be a boundary. It would be a betrayal. I told her no, as gently as I could, explaining that my financial stability was not just mine, it was Mom's safety net as well, that I could not put everything on the line for a business that had never been steady. I offered instead to pay for a financial counselor to help her restructure what she already owed, thinking that was reasonable, but her eyes hardened the way they always did when someone challenged her picture of herself as the perpetual giver. So you will send money for Mom, but you will not help me build something real for this family, she said, her voice low and sharp. You love playing the hero in uniform, but when it comes to actual sacrifice, I am the one here, not you. She pushed away from the table dramatically and left the papers there like an accusation. And later, I heard her telling Mom in the next room that I refused to support her dreams, that I did not understand what real responsibility looked like. That night, the house settled into its creaks and sighs. Linda went to bed early after taking her pills, the television in her room murmuring some talk show, and I sat in the darkened living room pretending to read, while my mind replayed the conversations of the past week, the $100 joke, the Facebook post, the loan request, every piece of it stacking into a pattern that felt too familiar. Another operation where someone was moving money and rewriting truth to suit their needs. Only this time the battlefield was my own family. I got up to get a glass of water and paused in the hallway when I heard Grace's voice behind her. Partially closed bedroom door, sharper. Now stripped of charm, she was on the phone with Tyler, her words spilling fast. If she will not help with the loan, we will just use her story. She said, people love military sacrifice, toxic family, broken veteran stuff. It sells. I pressed my back against the wall as my heart pounded, listening to her laugh softly, and those medals, she never even looks at them. They are just sitting there. We can do something with all of this. There was a pause while Tyler said something I could not hear. Then she added, between her rank and her sad single soldier life, we could spin this into serious money if we play it right. In that moment, the last illusion cracked. This was not simple carelessness or one bad decision. This was a strategy, a deliberate plan to turn my service and even my pain into a product she could monetize to turn me into a character in a story. Financial performance she controlled, and somewhere deep inside, a part of me that had always been patient with family finally went quiet, not in defeat, but in the focused stillness. I knew from operations the part that waited, watched patterns, and chose the exact moment to say no in a way that changed everything. The morning my medals almost vanished for $100 started quiet after hearing Grace, the night before pitching my life on the phone, like content for future fundraising and turning my toxic family into a story she could sell. I barely slept. So at first light, I did what I always did when my head felt like it would split. I ran. I stopped at one grave Staff Sergeant Miguel Reyes, the man who had once told me bluntly that if my family could not see my worth, that was their blind spot. Not my failure. He had died when a convoy did not make it back from a mission. I had supported his absence, rode beside me every time I stepped into a briefing room. They call it a toxic family. Now I told the stone quietly, but it feels more like I am the outsider in my own house, like I am the contractor and Grace is the client. I told him about the dinner and the $100 pawn shop joke about my sister posting my uniform online, like a prop to milk, sympathy about how she talked as if I were broken while she took in donations, and I admitted there were nights in a windowless intel cell that felt more like home than this living room ever had. When I walked into my mother's house 30 minutes later, I knew something was off before I saw anything. There was a thin, wrong note under the sound of the kettle and the morning news. My eyes went to the glass cabinet by habit, and my brain stalled. The shelf where the wooden case of my medals had always sat was empty, only a faint dust outline left behind, the kind you get when you drag something away without wiping what is underneath. My heart hit my ribs hard enough to hurt Mom. I called, "Where are my medals?" Linda came from, the hallway dish towel in hand, looked at the blank shelf and then at me. For barely a second, Grace just took some things she said to clear space. Do not start a war in this house. Avery, like asking about years of my life, was picking a fight. Like the real danger here was my temper, and not the fact that the most important objects I owned were gone. Where did she go? I asked, my voice tighter. Linda shrugged and said, "Aaron's told me not to be dramatic, reminded me that Grace did so much around here that I should be grateful someone cared about tidying up. And in that moment, something inside me went cold and very still, because it was clear that if this turned into conflict, she would see me as the aggressor, not the sister walking around with a box full of stolen history." While I stood there, trying not to shake, Grace was already pushing open the door of a narrow pawn shop wedged between a laundromat and a faded sandwich place. Across town, a bell chimed as she stepped in, carrying the box. The air inside smelled like old wood and metal shelves crowded with guitars, tools, and electronics that had all been important to someone once the glass cases held watches and rings that had outlived the promises they represented. Behind the counter, a man in his late 50s looked up, short gray hair, solid shoulders, name tag reading Sam. Behind him, a single-framed photo showed a younger version of him in uniform, standing in desert dust, with his arm around another soldier. It was the kind of picture you keep when your combat unit feels more like family than the one waiting back home. Grace set the box on the counter and announced that she had some military stuff her sister would never miss. She said I had more medals, that this was just clutter taking up space, then smiled and told him $100 for the whole box would be fine, like she was making a generous offer. Sam opened the flaps and his expression changed, not to excitement, but to a patient alertness. I knew very well he lifted one medal at a time, reading the engravings, tracing ribbons, seeing not trinkets, but a pattern of campaigns and commendations. Then he reached the one that should never have been there. The medal I kept tucked behind the rest because I still felt its weight in my bones. Its face carried a rare symbol he had seen only a handful of times in his career, and on the back, near the pin, a small coded sequence was etched, the kind of code that linked straight back to people with offices inside the Pentagon instead of on a base like mine. When his thumb brushed those numbers, he froze. His shoulders straightened as if someone had barked his name, and he looked up at Grace with a new sharpness. "You are telling me your sister received this?" he asked slowly, "and you bring it here for $100? She shrugged, said it was either this or she sold my old laptop, told him to pick one. Tossed in that bravery does not pay the bills anyway. echoing the lines she had thrown at me in front of our guests, her story. Financial brain reducing years of work and risk to a price tag and a joke. Sam shut the box gently and flipped the sign on the door from open to closed. Grace stiffened at the click of the lock and demanded to know what he was doing. He told her calmly that the sale was on hold while he checked something, his tone shifting from cashier to senior sergeant, in the space of one breath. Then he carried the box through a doorway into a small back room that smelled of paper and dust and machine oil. In there, he set the metals on a desk, opened a drawer, and pulled out a worn contact sheet and notebook from his years in service. As his fingers ran down the numbers, his pulse climbed, not from greed, but from recognition. He knew what class of award he was holding. He understood that not every medal came from a standard board. Some came directly from people whose decisions never reached the front page, yet changed entire maps. And he knew enough about the way our world worked to realize that someone willing to dump such a thing for cash probably was not protecting the person who earned it. He dialed the verification number listed for that code, a line that rerouted quietly through channels tied to the Department of Defense, explained that a rare medal bearing that sequence had just been carried into his shop by a relative of the recipient. And when they asked for a name, he gave mine, Major Avery Lockwood, Army Intelligence and Special Operations Support the woman some of his buddies had once called Oracle, with a mixture of respect and superstition. When my phone rang and I heard him introduce himself as Samuel Hayes, retired Master Sergeant and current pawn shop owner, saying he believed he had something of mine, and asking if I could come down alone, a chill ran through me that had nothing to do with fear. By the time I reached the shop, the sign was still turned to closed. Grace was gone, and Sam stood as straight as he had in the photo on the wall, the box on the counter between us, like a classified file. He opened it so I could see that every medal was still there, watched my jaw tighten when my eyes landed on the top one, and in his face I saw a quiet anger that matched the revenge emotional churn in my own chest, not at me, but at the idea that anyone would treat this like scrap. We talked in low voices about what had happened about toxic family and the way some betrayal arrives smiling. He promised there would be no record tying my name to any attempted sale. And after I left with the weight of the medals back in my hands, he went to the back room again this time to send a brief notice through a veterans network linked into his old contacts, flagging that a rare award and its owner might be vulnerable to people looking for fast money. He was not trying to get Grace arrested. He was doing what soldiers do when they sense a threat to one of their own. He was quietly bringing more eyes onto the situation, and that simple act became the first outside ripple of consequence, the opening move in the betrayal family karma that would one day fold back over my sister, like a wave she never saw coming. That night, after I left Sam's pawn shop with the weight of my medals in my hands and the heavier realization in my chest that my sister had been ready to trade them for quick cash, I drove back to my mother's house, but I did not go inside. Instead, I pulled into the far corner of the driveway, turned off the engine and the lights, and sat in the dark with my hands still wrapped around the box on the passenger seat through the front window. I could see the glow of the dining room silhouettes moving forks, lifting Grace, laughing at some joke, Tyler gesturing with both hands, while Linda leaned forward to catch every word they were eating, as if nothing had happened, as if the toxic family pattern that had just escalated into outright theft was a minor mood swing I would get over, not a line that could never be uncrossed. Sitting there, I felt something in me give way, not like an explosion, but like a quiet break in a load-bearing beam, a recognition that in this house I was not a daughter or a sister. I was a function, the person who sent money, who fixed what was broken, who did dangerous things far away so that bills could be paid and stories told. But the person behind that function, the woman who could be hurt, who could feel humiliation and grief, did not seem to exist for them. And that hollow realization was worse than any insult at the dinner table. I thought about the soldiers I had served with, the way their families had stood at ceremonies with tears and pride, how some mothers kept every citation in plastic sleeves, and some fathers could list each deployment by date and unit. Those families treated service like a sacred trust, even when they did not fully understand it. They never dismissed it as clutter, and the contrast between that care and the cold dismissiveness inside the house in front of me sharpened into a kind of pain that sat right behind my ribs, revenge. Emotional flared in me. The urge to storm inside, slam the box on the table, and demand answers. But years in the Army had taught me that the first reaction is not always the right one, that in conflict justice, what you do with the second breath matters more than what you do with the first. So instead of marching to war in the kitchen, I stayed in the car and let my training take over. When in doubt, gather intel, I told myself, treat this like any other operation. My family had become a hostile environment. And if I could analyze enemy networks in foreign countries, I could certainly analyze the story financial mess in my own home. I went through Grace's Facebook again on my phone, not as a hurt sister now, but as an investigator scrolling, slowly taking screenshots of every post where she used my picture in uniform or with medals, every caption where she talked about my supposed struggle, and tied it directly to pleas for donations to help with the family's mortgage or medical bills. I noted dates and times I noted, which posts she later edited, how some comments mentioned sending money through her personal account or through payment apps she had linked. I made a folder and dumped everything into it, creating a digital log of family betrayal she had carelessly published to the world. From social media, I moved on to emails and messages she had forwarded to Mom, the ones where she framed herself as the one carrying me, saying things like, "Avery will never ask for help, but we know she is suffering. If you could support us." You support her twisting narratives until I barely recognize myself. And with each screenshot, I felt my anger harden into resolve. Quiet justice would not come from shouting. It would come from showing who she really was when the lights were bright enough. Later, when the house went silent and the television in my mother's room finally clicked off, I carried the box inside, set it in my old bedroom, and then sat at the small desk with a stack of unopened mail Linda had left there for me to sort on this visit. She always said she could not make sense of the bank statements and insurance letters that I was the one with the smart brain for numbers. So I did what I had done 100 times before. Only this time, I looked with new eyes, searching for signs that the line between my support and Grace's consumption had blurred in ways I had not seen. The first thing that jumped out was a checking account under my mother's name, with a familiar bank but unfamiliar patterns, regular deposits from my automatic transfers, scattered withdrawals she did not recall making, and recurring debits that matched boutique shopping and restaurant names. I recognized from Grace's posts the account had 2 names on it. My mother's and Grace's joint ownership set up 3 years earlier, right around the time I had increased the amount I sent every month after a deployment. Linda had no idea how to navigate online banking, but Grace did, and the negative space between those facts told its own story. My money entered someone else, siphoned it for uses that had nothing to do with keeping the lights on. I spread the papers out and followed the path of each deposit, each payment feeling a mixture of disgust and clarity. No one had held a gun to my head to make me help my mother, but I had believed that help went where it was supposed to go. Discovering that Grace had been using the same lifeline to prop up her own image, to pay for the kind of lifestyle she flaunted, while dramatizing poverty to strangers, added another layer of betrayal to the pile, a pattern of exploitation that made the attempted sale of my metals feel less like an isolated act and more like the inevitable next step in a long chain of choices. Near the bottom of the stack, I found a thin envelope from 2 years back, half folded and barely opened, an informal letter addressed to my mother and me from a small local attorney. Grace sometimes used the language. Inside made my skin prickle. It referenced a generous gift from me to Grace and Tyler to support their young family. It thanked me for agreeing to transfer a sizable sum as an irrevocable gift. Not a loan and attached was a copy of a simple agreement, acknowledging that this amount would never be repaid. The signature line carried my printed name and a handwriting that looked almost like mine at first glance. The loops practiced the slant. close, but when I traced it with my eyes, I saw the tiny differences my training was designed to notice: the way the Y in my first name always dipped lower than the K in my last name, the way I left more space before Lockwood. Whoever had signed this had not gotten those details right. The Y barely dropped the spacing too tight. It was a forgery sitting in a file no one thought I would read. My stomach turned, but my mind sharpened. This was no longer about emotional slights or careless words. This was structural, a pattern of Grace, positioning herself as savior while quietly draining resources from the people she claimed to protect, a full spectrum of exploitation, from narrative theft to financial deceit to attempted conversion of my metals into cash. Her entire relationship to me was not sister to sister, it was user to source. And as I sat there in the small bedroom of my childhood home, surrounded by proof of how deeply my life had been mined without consent, I knew I was done playing the role of silent provider. I would not explode. I would not scream. But from that night forward, every interaction with Grace would be recorded, every lie documented, every use of my name or image tracked. Because if she wanted to turn my story into currency, I would make sure there was a complete record of the cost when the bill finally came due. The next morning, the house was still sunlight filtering through thin curtains, as if nothing in the world had shifted. But I walked into the kitchen carrying the wooden box of my medals with a steadiness that did not belong to the woman who had cried quietly in her car the night before. It belonged to the soldier who had survived darker rooms and colder silences. I set the box on the table deliberately, the click of wood against laminate, louder than it should have been. Grace turned from the counter, holding her mug, eyes widening for a fraction of a second before she gathered herself and pasted on the same confident tilt of her chin she used when she talked her way through bad real estate pitches. I asked her plainly where she had taken my medals, my voice low and measured, not the shout she expected, and almost seemed to brace for. And instead of answering, she reached for the narrative she had rehearsed 1,000 times in her life to dodge blame. She sighed dramatically and said she had only taken them to see how much insurance they might need, that she was trying to help, that with Mom getting older, she needed to make sure everything of value in this house was properly covered. She said it with the kind of false sincerity that made strangers adore her. But standing there, I saw the cracks, the way her eyes darted to the box, then back to my face, calculating how much I already knew. I did not bother arguing. There was nothing left to explain. Instead, I told her calmly and clearly that from now on, she would not touch my accounts, my medals, or my name. The words cut clean through the kitchen air, colder than anger, colder than disappointment. And for the first time since I arrived, she did not have a ready comeback. She only stared at me with a flicker of something like confusion, maybe even fear, because she was hearing a no that did not shake or waver, the kind of no that came from a woman who had made life or death calls in war rooms and lived with the consequences. I took the box and walked away without letting her say another word, because I knew she would try to twist it again into a story of her sacrifice, her struggle, her burden. But this time, I had already stepped off the path she controlled. The first move I made came quietly. The next day, I arranged a video call with a financial advisor who had helped several officers structure long-term plans after deployments. I explained the situation without naming Grace, keeping my tone clinical, almost detached, because I needed this to be strategy, not emotion. He guided me through creating a living trust for my mother, one that separated her essential funds from any account where Grace had signing authority, one that ensured every dollar I provided went directly toward medical costs, living needs, and long-term care. He helped me shift my monthly support into that trust, bypassing the joint account entirely. And by the time I hung up, I felt something lift in my chest, not satisfaction yet, but a quiet certainty that this was the first brick removed from the tower Grace had built from my silence. She would not realize the change immediately. The automatic transfers had always appeared on the same day. But when she logged in one morning and saw the balance lower than she expected, she would see the first crack in her financial control and not know where it came from. My second move was sharper, more surgical. I drafted an email to the pastor of the local church, the one Grace often used as a stage for her story, financial performances, about being the sister, holding our family together while caring for a struggling veteran sibling. I kept the email gentle, polite, almost apologetic, explaining that there seemed to be a misunderstanding, because donations collected under my name had never reached my mother. I attached screenshots of Grace's posts, the payment app receipts, and my own bank statements, showing that I had covered my mother's expenses myself. I asked only that they review their records to ensure everything was being used properly. The pastor responded within hours, thanking me for the information and promising to look into it quietly. True to that promise, they did not confront Grace directly. They simply closed the campaign and ended every future fundraising request involving our family, and within a few weeks, the flow of sympathy money Grace relied on slowed, then stopped. She would eventually blame the economy or church leadership or the lack of generous donors. But she would never connect the loss to the email I sent with the calm precision of someone cutting the right wire in a room full of explosives. By the time I returned to base later that week, the tension at my mother's house hung like fog. Grace avoided me. When she could, Linda tried to bridge the gap with small talk and tired smiles, but the air between us was shifting. The power dynamic tilting in a way I did not flaunt, but did not hide. Either at base, the rhythm of military life felt like a deep breath. After weeks of suffocating the sound of boots on pavement, distant helicopters, the smell of jet fuel, all of it grounding me again in the world where my name meant something real. One afternoon in the intelligence office, a colleague slid into my workspace grinning, holding up his phone showing me a meme circulating in our private group chat, a photo of a news bulletin from an internal Army publication, highlighting several nominees for a high-level award in intelligence and special operations. Under one of the pictures was the caption, "Female Major," known as Oracle. 7 recognized for exceptional contributions, my name not mentioned directly, but my code name unmistakable. He nudged my shoulder and said, "Looks like someone is finally getting credit." I could not help the small laugh that escaped me, softer than pride, but stronger than relief. Because here, at least, my identity was not a currency anyone else could spend. Later that night, as I was reviewing mission reports in my barracks room, an email alert chimed on my laptop. The sender was an address I recognized from previous high-level briefings, the subject line short and formal, an official invitation to Washington to attend a ceremony where certain classified portions of Operation Embergate would be partially declassified and presented to the public, including my role, my name, and my actions. For the first time, my work would exist outside sealed rooms and restricted files. For the first time, people not in uniform would understand what I had done. I sat back in my chair and let the realization sink slowly through me. This was the exposure my sister had never imagined when she sold my image for sympathy online. This was the kind of recognition that did not require revenge, because the truth itself would become the reckoning. I closed the laptop gently and exhaled, understanding fully that the consequences that were coming required nothing more from me. They were already in motion, and all I had to do now was step back and let the world see what Grace had spent years trying to bury under manipulation, entitlement, and lies. The first signs that something had shifted did not arrive as a dramatic explosion. They came like small lights going out around my sister, one by one. The kind of quiet dimming you only notice when you step back and look at the whole room. A few weeks after I moved my support into the trust and sent that email to the church, I got a text from Linda that said simply, "Grace seems stressed lately. Church ladies are not calling like." Before I read it, sitting in a windowless office on base in the middle of reviewing a report, and felt a strange mixture of sadness and something close to grim satisfaction. Not the gloating kind people imagine in revenge stories, more the calm knowledge that family betrayal and toxic family patterns cannot always hide when the light of scrutiny finally hits them. Back in Tacoma, Grace noticed first that the announcements at Sunday service no longer included her favorite segment, the heartfelt plea for support for a struggling family, caring for a wounded soldier sister. For months she had stood near the fellowship hall coffee pots, hands pressed to her chest as she spoke about my supposed hardships, then watched as people dropped checks and bills into envelopes with our last names scribbled on them. Now the pastor simply thanked the congregation for their ongoing generosity in general and moved on when she asked one of the coordinators about it. The woman smiled politely and said, "The church was reviewing how it handled personal fundraising and taking a break from all such campaigns. The explanation was neutral, but the fact that no one asked her to share our story anymore left her standing alone by the coffee hands, empty smile stiff." Around town, the temperature cooled in ways she could not quite explain. Neighbors who used to gush over her posts about caring for her veteran sister began greeting her with shorter nods, eyes flicking away faster. The cashier at the grocery store, who had once squeezed her hand and said, "Bless you for all you do for your family," now just rang up her items and said, "Have a good day," with the professional distance reserved for any other customer. It was not overt hostility, more like a subtle withdrawal of warmth, a collective pulling back from a drama family script they no longer trusted. In another part of Tacoma, Sam moved through his days at the pawn shop helping regulars and scanning the occasional military item with a mindset shaped by years in uniform over coffee one evening. With a few other veterans at the VFW hall, he mentioned, without names, that someone had recently tried to pawn a medal that should never leave the hands of the person who earned it. He described how he had recognized the code, how the story he heard about a sister who would not miss it had not matched the gravity of the award. The men around the table listened quietly, faces tightening in that particular way soldiers have, when something crosses a moral line. One of them said it sounded like someone was using a service member's sacrifice as a financial tool. Another shook his head and muttered that, in his view, that was a form of theft no less ugly than taking cash from a wallet. They did not know. Grace, they did not need to. The story alone was enough to become a cautionary tale they would repeat to others when talk turned to protecting veterans from exploitation at home as well as overseas. The ripple extended outward in ways Grace could not see a small network of older men and women who respected me as Oracle 7, even if they had never heard that code name sharing quietly that some families are healthy while others are dangerous, that not all conflict, justice happens on battlefields. Sometimes it happens at kitchen tables and bank counters. They did not plan a campaign against her. They simply decided that wherever possible, they would direct their generosity toward veterans whose families honored the service instead of harvesting it. When Grace tried to organize a new fundraiser a month later, a wine and charcuterie night at a local event space, framed around helping her supposedly overwhelmed household stay afloat while caring for an unwell sister, the room did not fill the way she had imagined. In the past, she had easily gathered 40 people this time. Barely a dozen showed up, some out of lingering loyalty, others out of curiosity fueled by the faint scent of scandal. The donation basket at the end of the evening held a few folded bills and one or two checks, far less than she was used to counting with triumphant smiles. Tyler helped her pack up the leftover food in tight, irritated movements, the tension between them thick enough to taste. On the drive home, he let his resentment spill, saying that before my visit, their family brand had been strong. People saw them as the steady heroes, the ones holding everyone together. Now someone had clearly poisoned the well. He said Avery has always been jealous of what we built. He tapped the steering wheel hard, insisting that my boundaries and my quiet justice had somehow sabotaged their efforts in his mind. The source of their growing isolation could not be the lies themselves. It had to be the woman who refused to be part of them anymore. Blaming me was easier than facing the betrayal family karma closing in. At family gatherings, the shift was just as visible. Though Linda did her best not to choose sides, some of her friends had read between the lines and stopped showering Grace with praise. They pulled me aside instead when I was in town to squeeze my hand and say things like, "We see you, we are grateful for your service. We are sorry, not everyone understands what that means." Their words were simple, but they began to rearrange the emotional landscape my sister had controlled for so long, stripping away the image of her as the tireless caregiver and exposing the fact that much of what she had built was rooted in manipulation rather than care. The most tangible sign that her choices were starting to draw official attention came on an ordinary weekday morning. Grace found a thick envelope in her mailbox bearing the letterhead of the Regional Real Estate Association. At first she assumed it was routine, maybe a newsletter or an invitation to a networking event. But as she read, her face went pale. The letter explained that a complaint had been lodged regarding her use of veteran hardship narratives in marketing properties, specifically mentions of a struggling military sister used to tug at buyers' emotions and influencers' wallets. There were questions about whether these stories accurately reflected the financial reality of the parties involved or whether they constituted misleading representations that might violate ethical standards. The association asked her to provide a written explanation, and any documentation supporting her claims. The language was formal, even polite. But beneath the professional tone lay a clear message. People were watching practices that had once gone unquestioned would now be examined. She called Linda in a near panic, pacing the kitchen and waving the paper, insisting that this was all an overreaction, that everyone used personal stories in sales, that this was just how you connected with people in a crowded market. She said a few jealous colleagues were probably out to get her. She swore that none of this would be happening if Avery had just played along. If I had not pulled my money and my name and quietly told the truth where it mattered, Mom, overwhelmed and confused, tried to calm her but could not give her the absolution she wanted. And as Grace kept talking louder and faster, the edges of her control began to fray in a way that even she could feel. Because for the first time in a long time, she was not the one writing the story. Other people were. And this time, they were asking hard questions instead of handing her envelopes full of no questions, asked cash. The day of the ceremony felt unreal from the moment I stepped off the shuttle and saw the clean, imposing lines of the Pentagon rising like a quiet giant against the pale Washington sky. The air held a kind of stillness I had only ever felt before the start of major operations, except this time, the mission was not classified, not hidden, not something locked inside a secure room. This time, the story that had been buried under years of toxic family noise was about to be spoken aloud in a hall full of uniforms, cameras, and people who understood what sacrifice meant. A young officer guided me through a long corridor lined with framed portraits of intelligence and special operations heroes from decades past. Faces of men and women whose names had never been printed in newspapers until long after their work was done. He stopped at a blank space on the wall and said softly, "That is where your portrait will go, Mom. Right there with the others." And for a moment my throat tightened. Because in this building my life was not clutter or a pawn shop joke. It was history. The hall was filled with rows of chairs, polished floors, and the low murmur of distinguished guests. The stage held a podium with 2 flags behind it, and screens on either side showed the title Intel and Special Operations Heroes. Recognition people in dress uniforms moved through the room with the precise, respectful awareness unique to these events, acknowledging each other with nods and brief greetings. And as I took my seat near the front, I felt the weight of something settling into place inside me, not pride exactly, not vindication, more a sense of being seen without distortion for the first time in years. When the Assistant Secretary of Defense stepped to the podium, the room quieted instantly. His voice carried with a calm authority as he spoke about the nature of intelligence work. How quiet operators often save more lives than anyone will ever know. How these individuals move through their careers, misunderstood by outsiders, sometimes even by their own families, because the truest parts of their service must stay hidden. Yet the impact of their decisions ripples across entire regions. He paused, then added that today They were choosing to honor the ones who had guided missions with brilliance and steadiness, never asking for recognition, only the chance to do the next right thing. Then he said the name that had existed for years, only inside secure networks, Oracle 7, and the room shifted subtly, as if the story behind that codename carried its own current. He explained that there was a reason entire teams requested her by codename, that under her watch, no unit had ever been lost, that her analysis in Operation Ember Gate had prevented a large-scale attack on a NATO base and safeguarded both American and Allied forces on the screens behind him. A simulated video sequence played out not classified details, but enough to show the trajectory of the threat, the intercepted communications, the urgent evacuations, the shift from imminent disaster to successful defense. And for the first time, the world outside my chain of command was given a glimpse of the moment my life had turned into something larger than my own breath. When he called me to the stage, the applause rose steady and warm, not the performative clapping of polite strangers, but the solid affirmation of people who understood the cost of every step that had led me there. The medal he placed over my shoulders gleamed under the lights, the same medal Grace had tried to trade for $100, and as cameras flashed, I felt the image imprint itself into the narrative of who I truly was, unfiltered by guilt trips or manipulation. Reporters approached after the ceremony, some from national outlets, some from military publications, and a few from regional papers that wanted a hometown angle. One of those smaller reporters from Tacoma read the press release with wide eyes, repeating softly, "Tacoma native Major Avery Lockwood, Oracle 7 honored at Pentagon for saving lives." And when she asked if I had family in town who might want to comment, I simply said they were aware of my service in ways that mattered and left it at that. Meanwhile, in Tacoma, the news broke across local broadcasts and social media faster than Grace could brace for it. Linda was in the living room folding laundry when the anchor announced that a major from their city had been recognized at the Pentagon. Then my face appeared on the screen, in full-dress uniform medals lined neatly across my chest, the same medals Grace had called clutter, the same medals she had mocked across the dinner table. The camera zoomed in on the one she had carried into Sam's pawn shop, and next to it, my full name and code name were displayed for a moment. The whole house went silent, except for the voice on the television explaining that a woman known in special operations circles as Oracle 7 had been honored for preventing a mass casualty attack. Grace stood frozen in the doorway, her hand still gripping her phone. Tyler stared at the screen in disbelief, and Linda covered her mouth as if she had seen a ghost she had once lived with but never truly recognized. Then a notification pinged on Grace's phone. A message from one of the women at church asking, "Isn't that your sister?" followed by another from a real estate colleague saying, "Wow, Grace, why didn't you ever say she was a hero?" And the tension in her shoulders tightened into something sharp and panicked. The exposure did not require a single cruel word from me. I had not raised my voice or posted a rant or confronted anyone. The truth had walked into their living room wearing my face and my uniform, and with one broadcast, the narrative Grace had built for years cracked in half. She had told everyone I was struggling, aimless, barely getting by. She had painted herself as the protector, the one who carried the family. But the woman on the screen was none of those things. She was a decorated officer standing before the Pentagon seal, while the highest levels of command praised her work, and people who had once pitied my family now pitied me for having them. The final twist of the day came when a reporter researching the hometown hero angle reached out to Grace directly asking if she would like to give a statement about what it felt like to be the sister of someone who had saved so many lives. Grace stumbled through a performance of pride and surprise and sisterly admiration, her voice wobbling between panic and forced sweetness. She said she had always known I was special, that she was honored to call me family. The words were syrupy and shaky, and she hoped desperately that the reporter would not dig deeper. But journalists, like soldiers, follow patterns, and this one looked beyond the surface. He contacted Sam, the retired master sergeant who had met me in his shop, asking if he wanted to comment on veterans looking out for one another. Sam agreed without hesitation. He described a situation involving a rare metal that had been brought into his shop by a relative of the recipient for a mere $100. He never said Grace's name. He did not have to the implication sat heavy and quiet in the article. And the paragraph that followed became the clearest mirror anyone had ever held up to my family. Some heroes are surrounded by support, the journalist wrote. Others are surrounded by misunderstanding. Readers did not need the names, they understood exactly who had stood where in that divide. Grace called the next morning while I was still in D.C., her voice so thin it sounded as if she were speaking through a crack in the wall. She began with a shaky breath, as if rehearsing a script, saying she had seen the news and that everything was blowing up online and clients were asking questions. She could not answer. Then she tried to slide into the soft, pleading tone she used whenever she wanted something from me, asking if I could please tell people the pawn shop situation was a misunderstanding. Because it was hurting her business and people were backing out of deals, she said my name like a lifeline she wanted to grab but had never earned. And I listened without interrupting because I had nothing left to give to that voice. She kept going, insisting we were still family, that one mistake should not destroy us, that she did not know the metal was important, that she would never have taken it if she had known the truth of who I was, and every sentence she spoke twisted the same way, bending reality to center her discomfort. Not the betrayal, not the years she had taken my money, my service, my image, my silence. Only the damage now bouncing back at her, and when she finally stopped for a breath, I let the quiet sit long enough for her to feel it. Then I asked her calmly if she really believed it was just one mistake, or if she could finally see the pattern that stretched across years, the pattern of taking and twisting and pretending, the pattern of using me when it benefited her and discarding me when it did not, the pattern of mocking the very work that paid her bills, while using that same work to get sympathy online, and there was no answer on her end, only a faint, trembling breath. She asked me to explain the situation to Sam, to call the veteran groups to post something online, softening the story so that she would not look like someone who had tried to sell a rare military honor for $100. She begged for my help smoothing her reputation, and I felt the shift inside myself the moment when the old reflex to fix everything finally broke. I told her I was done managing her reputation, that I had fought enemies overseas with less manipulation than she had used on me for years, and that I would not spend another ounce of strength fighting the consequences she had earned herself. She made small, wounded sounds as if I had struck her. But all I had done was withdraw the energy she had always drawn from me quietly, endlessly, without gratitude. I told her the boundary clearly, that we would keep minimal contact only for matters involving our mother, that she would no longer touch my accounts or my name, that she would not use my image or my service for sympathy or fundraising or excuses. And she tried to argue, but her voice faltered because for the first time, I spoke with the calm, unshakable tone I used when briefing commanders the tone that left no room for negotiation. After I returned to Tacoma, I did not go to the family house right away. Instead, I spent a day on base, catching up on work, filing travel documents, answering messages from colleagues who had seen the ceremony, and for the first time in years, I felt light walking across the parking lot, no invisible weight dragging behind me. Then 2 days later, my mother showed up at my apartment, unannounced with a small container of homemade bread. She stood on my doorstep, looking smaller than I remembered, almost shy, and when I let her in, she sat on my couch and held the container in her hands, like a peace offering she was afraid to place down. She said softly that she had seen everything online, that people from church had told her what they had heard, that Sam had spoken so respectfully about me when interviewed. And she admitted she had not known how to see me until now, because she had spent years listening to a version of me, filtered through the child who needed attention the most. And she pressed her lips together and finally whispered that she was sorry, truly sorry. Not dramatic, not defensive, just a quiet acknowledgement that the world had shown her what she had refused to see on her own. We sat in silence for a while, but it was the first comfortable silence between us in a long time. A silence where I did not feel like a burden or a utility, and she did not feel like someone I had to win over. Then she left the bread on the table and hugged me before going, and that small gesture felt more healing than any award. In the evenings, I settled back into my own rhythm, watering the 2 plants near the window, answering messages from soldiers I had mentored, unpacking my duffel, slowly placing the medals on my desk before arranging them inside the glass frame Sam had gifted me after the pawn shop incident. The frame was simple and sturdy, the kind of thing a soldier understands, and when I hung it on the wall above my desk, I felt a steady warmth rise in my chest, because the medals were finally in a place where they were respected and safe. One night, while I poured water into the soil of the taller plant, my phone buzzed with a message from a young soldier who had once confided in me about her own toxic family. She wrote that my story had given her strength to keep going, that seeing someone survive betrayal at home while thriving in uniform made her believe she could carve her own path without apology. And I felt something soften inside me, a reminder that the real impact of quiet justice is not in punishing the ones who hurt you, but in choosing to step out of their shadow and let others see the way forward. I stood there in my small apartment listening to the hum of the fridge and the calm stillness of the night, thinking about the long road that had carried me from chaos to clarity, and the story settled into me like a truth I had earned. That quiet justice is not revenge by destruction. It is the quiet reclaiming of your own worth, the decision to stop feeding the people who feed on you, the strength to stand alone until the world sees you clearly. And as I looked once more at the framed medal on the wall, I knew I had reclaimed something far more valuable than approval I had reclaimed myself. If you are living your own version of a toxic family or silent revenge, remember that standing up for yourself is not hate, it is dignity over money. Share this with someone who needs a lesson in betrayal, injustice without hate, and in revenge through truth.